Coming up, a look at voter participation through the lens of the documentary An African Election, which you may have seen here on World Channel. In 2008, the nation of Ghana came out in force to elect a new president with a 70% turnout. Will we see that kind of turnout here in the U.S. on November 6th? Tonight, we look at the power of participation in the democratic process. Stay tuned as we talk about it in our Your Vote 2012 special.
Major funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Ghana, December 2008. Election fever is running high as voters prepare to choose their new president.
We love our mother Ghana, so we want everybody to take part in this election.
With a troubled past featuring military coups and Ghanaians battling growing economic hardship, there is much at stake.
If every 4 years you go to the polling station and you put a piece of paper in a ballot box and you are not generating sufficient wealth and you are not distributing the wealth that is generated equitably, and people still suffer poverty, ignorance, and disease and so on, democracy is absolutely meaningless.
When people are insecure, they do not know where the next meal is going to come from. They think that their situation is going to get worse tomorrow on that and so forth. Then you do not really have stability.
And mindful of the disputes and violence that overshadowed recent elections in Kenya and Zimbabwe, Ghanaians are determined to participate in a peaceful African poll that's free and fair.
But God said, we got a queue till the last person who is in the queue finishes voting before the poll will close. That's why I asked the military to come. They will give them light, they will protect the queue, and everybody will vote.
And vote they did. Almost 70% of eligible voters formed long lines, many standing for more than 8 hours. Polling stations stayed open long past closing time to allow voters to cast ballots.
And the results are as follows.
After a close first round of voting and tense runoff election, the result was a process that led to a peaceful handover of power in one of the world's youngest democracies.
I want the Western world to come and learn from what we have in Africa, because I think that we have a lot of wonderful things here that are overlooked because we are considered to be poor and backward and unstable. And to show that as a community, we respect, we learn, we grow together.
Across the Atlantic, one of the world's oldest democracies is dealing with issues of respect and working together as another presidential election approaches. The previous one in 2008 drew a record 62% of eligible Americans to the polls. What will voter participation look like in November 2012? A recent Gallup poll shows voters are less interested and engaged in this election than in previous ones. And some argue laws requiring voters to show ID at the polls in 31 states will further impact turnout and the election outcome.
A democracy is only as strong or as weak as the participants in the process choose to make it.
Welcome to Your Vote 2012. I'm Celeste Headlee. Now, elections are a pillar of any democracy. So how people participate in the process, or whether they participate at all, has a real impact, not only on that democracy, but on how its people fare. In the 2008 presidential elections in the U.S., a record 131 million Americans came out to vote. It was also a record-setting election for minorities. More than 63% of eligible African-American voters cast ballots. But the 2012 election has a different forecast. Experts predict the numbers of minority voters, or any voters, will be significantly lower. There are a number of reasons for that, and it's what we want to talk about today. Joining me in the studio is Stephanie Robinson, of the CEO of the Jamestown Project, which is a Harvard University democracy think tank, and Lenny McAllister, who is a commentator and blogger. Joining us remotely via Skype is Jareth Mertz, the Swiss-Ghanaian director of the film An African Election, Derek Ashong, an activist, broadcaster, and artist who also has roots in Ghana, Megan Ortiz, publisher and managing editor of Vivir Latino, and Stacey Washington, blogger and commentator. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us. And welcome to those of you who are watching. We invite you to join the conversation on Twitter at #AfricanElection. So let's get started with you, Jareth. First, can you explain to us why you wanted to make a film out of that particular election?
Well, it started off as a personal journey, identity searching, that was. And it had to do, I grew up in Ghana, and I hadn't been back in the country for 28 years. And no better way than to go back and look for your roots, so to speak. The elections then slipped in. I thought, has there ever been a documentary, a feature documentary, looking behind the electoral scene, behind the into the presidential and electoral arena? And I found nothing on it, and I thought this would be exciting to actually create a feature documentary. It has to do also with preconceived ideas. I feel like, the way that Africa is perceived and the bad news always, living around elections in Africa had to be demystified, and this was the perfect chance to do so.
So what kind of parallels did you see between the elections in Ghana, and what contrasts maybe between those there and the U.S. elections?
Mainly, I would say the passion. In Ghana, to me, it just felt like it was more of a do-or-die affair in the sense that, your vote matters in the way it would change your living conditions. Like if you live on a Ghana cedi or $1 a day, if only 50% of the population of the country has access to clean water, and those that don't have it on a regular basis, the stakes are completely different. In the end, of course, we're all hoping for change, to our lives. So I would say in the end, we're all faring the same. We want change to make our lives better.
And yet they end up getting a much higher turnout than we do here. So is there a difference in the way maybe politicians in Ghana engage voters as opposed to the way we engage them here?
I think it has to do with democracy fatigue in the Western world and also in the U.S. In Ghana, you still believe that, things can change with your vote. In the U.S., we're more complacent. We have a certain living standard, and if we go and vote or not is not a do-or-die affair for us. So I think that's, one of the main reasons.
So, Stephanie, let me ask you, the voters in Ghana are pretty jaded about their politicians. They have a lot of complaints about the difference between the rhetoric they hear and what actually happens when they get in office. There's also a lot of doubts about how much their votes are worth or whether they'll be tampered with. That's similar to U.S. voters. So what's the difference here? Why do we sometimes have this enthusiasm gap?
I think that Jareth is right. One thing is Ghana is new to democracy. It's flowering. It's just coming into its own. And I think that they have a sense of patriotism and pride for their country, Mother Ghana, that is different. And we're looking at a different context, period. So I think that Ghanaians are very excited about democracy, excited about what the change is. I think it's real. They see their politicians up close and personal. When we were able to look at the film, we saw that, the politicians, former elected officials, they know them. They're on the ground. They're gritty. They're there with them. And I think that you feel a sense of familiarity, you feel a sense of investment, you feel a sense of passion, a sense of hope. And what I really liked is that you saw in Ghana the demos, the people participating in a way with passion, with commitment, right, with the desire to be able to move things in a positive way. And I just think that we are so removed, right, oftentimes from this process.
And that's really the question.
The removal.
And let me ask that to you, Lenny, because you saw it there in their elections. They were sitting there while they counted votes, and it became a community event. How do we do that in the U.S., though? with a much larger population. How do we retain that sense of community that they seem to have there?
But we've moved away from the Mr. Smith goes to Washington model of politics. We have made this big business, big media business as well. So people feel a detachment because when they know their candidates nowadays, they don't know them from debates or shaking hands. They know them through the media. They know them through super PAC ads. They know them through online ads. Therefore, it's just like meeting the Kardashians in a lot of ways. So you have that detachment where people are looking almost as voyeurs versus as participants and voters. And until we get back to a point of time where people see the personal investment in everything that they vote on, every vote that their elected official votes on, you're going to still see this detachment, and that detachment is going to lead to the cynicism that we have in the American system.
All right, well, let me put this to Derek, because this is something you engage in your artistry, in your activism, and you've experienced, to a certain extent, both Ghana and the United States. So how do we cross this bridge in some ways more sophisticated, older democracy? How do we, again, get that sense of community in terms of our voting?
Well, I think a big part of the problem facing the United States right now is that you're lacking community in the voting process and in the whole electoral milieu, largely because people don't feel that their voices are as valuable or as valid. And to some degree, they're right. If you look at the way in which elections are financed in this country, and you particularly look at how campaign finance has shifted more heavily towards investment by large, moneyed, and private interests in the wake of the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court in 2010, it's kind of hard to argue to a voter like, yes, your vote matters, yes, your vote counts, your voice is critical. The fact is their vote does matter and their voice is crucial. But when so much of the dialogue is dominated by moneyed interests, the whole democratic ideal is actually diluted. So when people are seeming to be apathetic or seeming to not feel connected or seeming to feel like, oh, this doesn't matter too much to me, on the one hand, we can look at that and say, hey, that's not the kind of democratic ideal we want. On the other hand, we have to look and say, well, are these people crazy, or is there something going on that is actually undermining our democratic values here?
Well, let me ask you, Stacey Washington, then. The Citizens United wasn't around in 2008. Obviously, that's something that happened that's since then. We had a record turnout in 2008. Why did we have a record turnout then, and could it be duplicated now?
Well, I mean, part of the reason for the record turnout in 2008 was pretty simple. It was a historic election that everyone wanted to participate in. Everyone wanted to cast a vote either for the first Black president of the United States or against. And it was a real ideological shift in some ways because Barack Obama represented at that point in 2008 a new visionary type of a politician, and he presented himself in that way. And so it was that election is unique. And so I think it's kind of a microcosm in itself. We can't really compare that to 2012 because 2012 we're voting on the re-election of the first Black president, not whether or not we're ever going to have a first Black president. I think that Citizens United, yes, there's a lot of special interest money in the American system of politics, but we have to look at the big picture, which is, in the end, we still have debates. In the end, we still have candidates traveling around the country and shaking hands with the citizenry, trying to win their votes on a one-on-one way. We still have surrogates knocking on doors. So there's still an opportunity to engage with candidates on a one-on-one level. And I think a lot of Americans are not doing so because they are busy doing other things. And in America, we have a very high-paced lifestyle. But the most important thing for us to focus on, if we're going to talk about voter participation, is a voter invested in this process or not? And for a lot of Americans, they're not invested in it, and they don't become invested until a couple of weeks before the election when they make their decision on who they're going to vote for.
Well, then
so
let's take this directly to Megan Ortiz, because Megan, you work a lot with voter registration, especially on the Latino community. Why are people not invested in politics? Do they not make a connection between what happens in their own life and what's happening on Capitol Hill? What are the things, the barriers that they feel is between them and the voting booth?
You know, I think Celeste, it really is a number of issues. You know, here in Los Angeles and other urban areas like New York City, I think we don't have the connection with people running for election as we did before, because these states like California and New York, they're not under attack in terms of voter disenfranchisement as in other parts of the country. So these states, in large urban areas where we have large people of color communities, we have candidates coming here to ask for money and not campaigning so much, because these are so-called safe states for Democrats, for Barack Obama, for example. And Mitt Romney won't even campaign. He'll just, come to ask for money and make secret videos that show up. So I think it's hard for people to make that connection. And also I think policy-wise, that hope that we had in 2008 coming from the Latino community in terms of policies ranging from employment and immigration reform, we haven't seen policies that have worked in our favor. We've seen policies that have in fact gone against what the president has promised. So I think there's been just a lack of trust completely in the system, because Latinos came out in droves during the 2008 election, especially in swing states where we really saw in places like Nevada, for example.
Will they this time around, and if not, why not? And let me bring that back to our studio guests. Why do voters perhaps feel that there are barriers between them and the voting booth? I mean, is it because perhaps of some of the recent push for voter ID laws in some states? Is that putting up a barrier between some people? What's going on?
I mean, I think that when you start talking about issues of voter suppression, it's real. It is a real barrier, and it's particularly a barrier for people of color, whether it's Latino or it's been a barrier for black folks for a very long time. It's a barrier for a lot of poor people, particularly poor elderly people and young people. And when you have people who are handing out flyers telling you the vote comes on Tuesday and the vote actually comes on Thursday, or when you say that you have to have this form of identification, particularly with the voter ID laws, and people just don't have it, or people don't know where to get it, or people are just not engaged yet, or people may be out and getting ready to vote and not have it in their purse. I mean, these are barriers that have been put up and are continuously being put up, and they are disenfranchising the vote. And so I think that people are put off very much by that.
Well, Lenny, why is this particular push toward voter ID laws happening right now? I mean, there's not really any evidence of any kind of, I'm not going to say widespread voter fraud. So why?
Well, there's two things you have to look at. I mean, if you look at the altruistic reason behind this is we do live in a transient society. We do have people migrating from the Northeast to the Sun Belt. We do have people that are coming in from different areas, and we have people that are basically living bi-coastal, and we have some issues we have to take care of. There's a way to do it proactively. Now, at the same time, you also have some of the issues that come into play when it comes to strategy and throwing some of these swing states into play.
Political strategy.
Yes, absolutely. Now, you can't have voter validation. You should put that into place in a proactive way, but in a way that does not disenfranchise anybody.
But Lenny, you should put it in place before we're in the middle of an election.
I concur with that. And one of the things that I've advocated for was I am for voter validation, but I've also stood with the NAACP in states such as my native Pennsylvania saying if you put a law into place in March, you don't apply it for the primary, you try to put it into place in November, you say that these IDs should be free and accessed liberally, but then the Department of Transportation does not allow those IDs to be available, then you have a problem, then it becomes suppression. But there is a way to have voter validation and do it effectively and proactively without trying to go after the presidential election as your first
Let me throw this
basis.
to Derek Shong. Derek, maybe you can expand on this, because it looks like what's being perceived as voter suppression is actually motivating voters who might have stayed away from the polls otherwise.
Well, we hope so, but we're not really going to know until the election actually happens. That's the insidious thing about voter suppression. It undermines the value of the entire process. And I would say to that, there's been recent news about this particular GOP contractor that was hired to do voter registrations in the state of Florida, and now there are allegations of fraud. They've been fired by the state party. Well, Florida is obviously a very sensitive state, particularly given what happened, some of the things in 2004, but most specifically in 2000. And 2000 is when I got my American citizenship. And as such, it was really the first time I had an opportunity to vote in my life. And I will never forget the sense after that election of being so proud beforehand and being like, hey, I've gone to become an American because I want to have a full democratic experience. Ghana at the time, 2000 was a landmark election, but I got my citizenship
Well, it was a landmark election for you. But let me throw this to Stacey Washington, though.
Let me just finish this point. It's really important. When it came to 2000 election, for me, getting a chance to vote as an American, having felt like I was disenfranchised as a Ghanaian, and then seeing what happened electorally in Florida then, it completely diminished my view of American democracy. And that is the issue with voter suppression. People will think less of the democratic process if they don't feel it's fair.
Well, then let me put that to you, Stacey. What do you think the effect of all of this drama over voter IDs, over voter suppression, all of these court cases going on right now, what effect will this have, do you think, on turnout?
Okay, so historically speaking, we're talking about two different things here. Voter suppression is where one group organizes and tries to suppress the vote or prevent people from voting. Voter ID laws are not intended to suppress votes. They are intended to ensure that voter fraud does not occur. And I know the argument is usually, well, there's not a significant amount of voter fraud going on, so what's the big deal? This has to be a racist ploy by the Republicans or the people on the right to stop blacks from voting. Well, I'm black. I have an ID. Most people have an ID. The difference in whites and blacks and what kind of ID they have has been found to be statistically 1.6% difference. Okay. So 1.6% more of white people have IDs than blacks.
Okay, well,
so
then
it's not about race. So look, we're talking about example, the Minnesota state election. There were 1,100 felons who voted in that election, and the actual issue was decided. The election was decided by 312 votes. So if 1,100 felons hadn't voted, then the election would have went the other way. So voter ID and having proper ID for voters, I agree with Lenny, you don't enact voter ID legislation right before a major election. But what we're not discussing here is that there have been pushes for voter ID over the years. And
there have been, but since you said this is not voter suppression, let me take this back to Stephanie, because you brought up the phrase voter suppression. Why do you make this connection between voter ID and voter suppression?
I actually make the distinction between voter fraud and voter suppression, but I think the voter ID is a part of the conversation. When we're talking about, your question was, why are people going to feel there's a barrier to be able to get to the ballots? And these are reasons why people feel that there are barriers to get to the ballots. And I think that when you start talking about the right to vote, and I just want to bring it back to this when Stacey's saying this, I mean, there's a constitutional right to vote. And that means that everybody should be able to vote. And so when we start trying to come up with ways, and when states start trying to figure out how they can deter people from voting, or how they can make sure that people have what they need in order to vote, I think that the default position should be we want to have as many people voting as possible. And so when you have these laws or these regulations that come up that have a disproportionate impact on people of color or any other group of people, then I think that poor people. Then I think that we have an obligation as Americans, and I think that it was Derek who started talking about the issue of legitimacy. I mean, I think that's a big issue that he was talking about. He didn't feel that he was legitimate, that he was upset that his vote didn't seem to count in 2000. And when the legitimacy starts getting into the process, and when people start questioning whether or not our process, whether our elected officials
coming to the ballots. But let me take this to you, Jareth, one moment, Lenny, because obviously there are these same kind of feelings in Ghana. I mean, many of the people in your film talked about these same sorts of issues, and yet they turn out to vote anyway. Why?
They really hoped that, their vote would make a change, and they, Ghanaians, we're very proud. We believe that we're the beacon of hope when it comes to democracy and visionary thoughts in Africa. And that's a culture. People listen to radios, they read the newspapers, even people who we deem to be, non-literate, engage in the public, affairs and domain. And I think, speaking of the U.S., it's also like the responsibility of the electorate, the voters, to educate themselves and to find ways of making sure that when you go out, you're equipped, you're well equipped to go out there and make your voice heard.
Well, so Lenny, if you were to project what the turnout will be, knowing all that you do about voter ID laws, everything else that's going on, what do you think is going to happen?
It's going to be probably 5% less, 3 to 5% less. And the reason why I say that is...
In 2008?
Yes. And part of that is you don't have the historic nature. But as well, you also have to look at the bigger picture. President Obama, when he was Senator Obama, was the image of an ideal, that you can have hope, that you can change Washington from the inside and have a different type of political brand. What did he just say on another network?
He said you
can't change it from the inside to the outside.
He also said the 2008 election was about us, the people, right?
And so from there now you're talking about somebody that has shown himself to be a typical politician.
Okay.
So that has come out of the mix. You have the voter ID issue. Some want voter validation. Some say there's voter suppression. That goes into the mix.
Yeah.
Another thing we're not talking about is the fact that you have so many districts that have been so gerrymandered that you have very few elections, not just at the federal level, but at the state level and at the local level that are actually up for a real election.
Yeah.
People go to the voting box and say, I'm in Chicago, I'm a Republican. Is there anybody that I can vote for in the primary? There was, I think, 4 people on the ballot when I went to go vote just a couple years ago. So you have those
from the
type of
rest of
things
our
out there.
guests. Derek, what do you think? The turnout for this year?
I think the turnout will be less, but I do think that it'll be significant. It won't be less for the reasons that have been stated. I think that what's going to be more interesting is to see what level of ground game the two parties deploy. I'm going to anticipate, yes, you're going to see a flood of last-minute advertising, but I don't think that's what's going to make the difference. What's going to make the difference is who actually shows up to the polls and who actually gets to cast a ballot.
Okay, Megan, what do you think? A turnout, especially in comparison with 2008?
You know, I think the turnout will be definitely less. I think a lot more than people are saying here, maybe even 10% less. But yeah, it's going to depend who comes out to vote, and I think it's actually going to be a closer election than most people want to admit.
Okay, Stacey Washington, what do you think? Let me get your projection as well. Turnout in 2008, obviously, record numbers. This time around?
Absolutely, it was record in 2008. Well, it will be less this time. I think it'll be less due to voter suppression or voter ID laws, more attributable to the fact that a lot of Americans are simply miserable. They're out of work. They've been out of work for 24 months, and their situation is depressing. So when you have a large number, we have unemployment persistently over 8% for over 41 months.
Yeah.
So we're talking about, we're out of a recession, according to the economists, but a lot of Americans have not yet turned that corner, and that is a very high chance of lower turnout. But the higher intensity level is on the side of the Republicans. Their intensity scores are outpacing the Democrats by a large margin. So yes, the voter turnout will be less than 2008, but it remains to be seen whether it will be on both sides.
All right. Well, Jareth, you directed the documentary. Tell us what advice we should take from Ghana to improve the turnout that all of these people predict will be bad.
Well, I hope that the turnout will be higher in the U.S. this year, just because of the fact that that there's a young generation out there that wants hope. And they weren't able to vote last time around, and this time they want to make their voices heard. And the lessons learned from Ghana are that, you have to allow, people have to know that, come 4 years, you have a chance to make a change. It's the power of the thought is what it's called in Ghana. You participate, maybe you're not happy with what you voted for 4 years ago, but here's another chance. You have to hold your leaders accountable. And that's the philosophy and the ideology that's going around in Ghana now, is that my vote counts. No matter what, in the end it counts, because you don't want to just put a piece of paper in a box or go and vote if nothing changes. That's not what the electoral process is about, and we shouldn't fool ourselves that we have responsibility, and if we want to make our voices heard, we have to stand to it.
Well, the power of thumb being because they use their thumbprint. Once they've voted, they put their thumbprint on there. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us for this panel discussion tonight. Stephanie Robinson, Lenny McAllister, Megan Ortiz, Derek Ashong, Stacey Washington, and Jareth Metz as well. It's important to talk about these issues like we have and mull over why people choose to participate or choose to stay home. But analysis has its place and its time, and that's before November 6th or after November 6th. Election Day is a day of action. It's time to set aside all the rhetoric and exercise the most powerful tool that you have as an American citizen, your vote. There is only one thing that can combat the power of money on Capitol Hill, your vote. Only one thing that can break the stalemate between entrenched political parties, your vote. Please use it. We've been talking for a half hour, but we want to hear from you what you have to say. You can continue the conversation at #AfricanElection. Thanks.